Hello, good afternoon. I am Monica Figueroa, librarian for Inclusive Excellence with the UNC University Libraries and chair of the library's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Council. On behalf of University Librarian Elaine Westbrooks and UNC Press's Spangler Family Director John Shear, welcome to this afternoon's presentation of Professor Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore and her book, Bearden, In the Homeland of His Imagination, An Artist's Reckoning with the South. Thank you for joining us for our final event in this year's virtual series, Off the Shelf, which is a co-production of the libraries and UNC Press to present new works published by the press that explore racial and social justice in our history and our world. Over the next hour, Erin Smithers will be in conversation with Professor Gilmore about her book. Before we begin, please note that the Q&A box is open for your questions, which we'll have time to moderate towards the end of our hour together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Erin, our host for this afternoon's conversation. Erin Smithers is a folklorist with a background in documentary studies and television and radio production. Erin has worked as a preservation audio engineer and curatorial assistant at the Southern Folklife Collection and currently works with researchers, students, and faculty as Special Collections Research and Instruction Librarian at Wilson Library. He serves as the music editor for Southern Cultures, the journal for the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC, and as an instructor of audio documentary at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. Thank you, Erin, for hosting our conversation this afternoon.
Thank you, Monica. And I'm glad, very glad to be here to welcome Dr. Gilmore. I'm gonna offer a brief introduction of Dr. Gilmore. Dr. Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore is the Peter B. and C. Van Wilber Professor of History and African American Studies and American Studies. She earned her PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which hopefully we can talk about a little bit. She's the author of many books, including the one we'll be talking about today, but also Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, 1919 to 1950, which was one of the American Library Association's notable books of 2008. Editor of Who Were the Progressives and co-editor of Jumpin' Jim Crow, Southern Politics from Civil War to Civil Rights. And her first book, Gender and Jim Crow, Women in the Politics of White Supremacy in North Carolina, 1896 to 1920, the winner of the Frederick Jackson Turner Award, the James A. Raleigh Prize, and the Julia Cherry Spruill Prize, as well as the Heyman Prize. Dr. Gilmore has been the fellow of many organizations, including the American Council of Learned Societies, the fellow of the Society of American Historians, the Guggenheim Foundation, National Humanities Center, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's the former president of the Southern Association for Women's Historians and offers graduate courses, reading and research courses in 20th century political and social history, African American history after 1865, history of the South since 1865, and teaches undergraduate courses on African American history, progressive era, U.S. political and social history, and is on the faculty of African American Studies and American Studies. So glad to welcome Dr. Gilmore here today from Ireland. Welcome, Dr. Gilmore. Thank you for being here. And I should say, I'm really also very grateful to be here to talk about your book, Romare Bearden in the Homeland of His Imagination, a wonderful UNC Press book and one of the first imprints on the Ferris and Ferris imprint, our friends, Dr. Bill and Marcy Ferris. Thank you, Dr. Gilmore, for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. The only other place I would rather be than Ireland, of course, is Chapel Hill. We've got it together.
Thank you. Can you, just to start, introduce some of our viewers and listeners here today just what your inspiration behind this book. You know, we look at some of your earlier work as a historian. This is a little bit of a transition away from that towards this art history or this exploration of Romare Bearden. How did you get interested in Bearden?
It's basically personal and professional at the same time. I lived in Charlotte before I went back to graduate school at Chapel Hill, and was there from 73 to 93. It was the Bearden discovery, the Bearden Renaissance. And there were so many references, stories. The Mint Museum had an exhibition of Bearden works in 1970. So there was kind of a Bearden rage going on. It was great. When I began writing Gender and Jim Crow, which was my dissertation, so roughly the late 80s, I realized pretty quickly as I was reading the African-American newspaper, the Star of Zion, which was published in Charlotte, that Beardens were AME Zion people. They were all over the newspaper, and that his great-grandmother and his grandmother, with whom he lived as a child, were very active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So I began seeing references. I saw references to his mother when I was writing Defying Dixie. And in fact, she's in the book. She was, after they moved to Harlem, she became a Democrat and a Democratic politician. And so she became Internal Revenue Service Deputy Director in New York. She was constantly backing candidates, met with Eleanor Roosevelt. So I had background personally. Of course, I saw the exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in the early 2000s that Ruth Fine curated about Romare Bearden. And then I decided I would write about him, but I didn't really know how I would do it. In the meantime, Mary Schmidt Campbell, who is an art historian, did a full biography of Bearden, which has come out a few years ago and was an excellent spine for me, because I was really interested in the process of memory, history, depiction of place. And as I began writing the book, I became interested really in a kind of different kind of biography, a biography of his artistic practice as he went through the years. So it grew. I wrote several books in the meantime from the time I first had the idea. So 18 years later, this book came out.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a long time sometimes to generate those thoughts, right? And to generate those ideas. I definitely want to come back to his writing about the history of his artistic practice. But as you were mentioning, you know, the Star of Zion newspaper, and thinking about, you know, our work in libraries and archives, and, you know, the Star of Zion newspaper is now, or at least what's extant of it that we have access to, is now digitized and online via the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center. And you reference sort of, you know, how the ability to do certain kinds of archival research now versus, you know, the past, you know, opens up a lot more information from the archival record about Bearden's family in Charlotte and his history. You also talk about how you, as a historian, learned to read a visual archive, you know, against a textual archive. And I find it really interesting. And I wonder if you can talk about that tension between the archival record and, you know, Bearden's memory and imagination as reflected in his work. And I'll just stop there. Yeah.
Okay, I'll talk about the archive first. When I spent 6 days looking for someone in the microfilm census. So the very process of doing genealogy, of finding people's forebears, has completely revolutionized itself. I found Bearden's great-grandfather, with whom he lived while he lived in Charlotte, and till he was about 5. I found him in the Chester, South Carolina census, born in 1845, an enslaved person. And through that, I found the white family that had enslaved him. So it's so much easier and quicker, but it's also more fruitful today than it was when I first began writing Gender and Jim Crow using the African-American newspaper Star of Zion. There were 2 copies existing. One was at the University of Chicago, where I think John Hope Franklin had used it, and one was in the Charlotte Public Library. And so the plethora of information, I think, is a blessing. It's absolutely a blessing, but it can be a curse because you can't be as definitive as once you went to the archive, you did what you went over everything that it had, you were sure that you had the story, and you went off and wrote definitive history. I'm writing history much more subjectively now because I know just in the 18 or so years I worked on this, new facts came to light all the time about his life that contradicted some of the things I thought earlier. But my purpose, really, and part of this is with the encouragement of Kate Douglas Torrey, who was the director of the press when I began, was to write the book using his art as an archive. And a lot of people have commented that Bearden's art is autobiographical. It's not exactly autobiographical. It's somewhat autobiographical. It's part history. It's part memory. It's the product of a very extensive fine arts education in addition to his BA at NYU. And so there's kind of a melange, kind of a collage of influences that go into what he is depicting. And sometimes Bearden himself it's getting snatches of memory. So I was interested in the art, not to take it literally, but to see what it was suggesting about him, see what it was suggesting about the South. And later, as I came to know more about his artistic practice, to situate it within that, to see elements of Cubism and Fauvism and the lines that he learned from his teacher, George Grutzy. So all of that came together in a way that told a story of its own. It wasn't until kind of late in the process, though, that I in the beginning, I placed the art, I talked about the material culture within the art, but I didn't really interpret the art as a kind of riff. And then I realized that Bearden wanted you to tell stories about his work. He was telling stories, and I don't think that he would have told any one story. And so he was inviting you to use your own imagination to talk about it. And so ultimately in the book, I do that. I tell stories that might not be other people's stories about what we're looking at.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Just thinking about, the nature of institutional archives as they exist and how they are so full of gaps in the historical record, particularly of marginalized communities, or particularly of communities of large families of African-American families who migrated north. And you talk about a little bit in the book about how his work serves as this visual archive of Black Southern migration. And I think that maybe can lead to talking a little bit about his artistic practice, in the sense, I think we talked about this between us, but my exposure to Romare Bearden's work initially was after I came to Chapel Hill, and was in a course with Dr. William Ferris, And you know, we were talking about visual art and Southern music, and you know, one of the pieces that we looked at, or one of the things, is looking at something like the folk musicians here,
Yes.
and starting to explore the different themes and the visual relationship between visual art and music, and not being aware myself of Bearden's life and career. You know, I initially sort of interpreted him as a folk artist, or you know, an artist coming, you know, from more of a vernacular tradition. And so reading your book, you know, I learned very differently about the history of his artistic practice, his dedication to study of the old masters and art history. But I just, before we get too far ahead, you know, this is one of his earlier works, and I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about, you know, how this fits within that history of his practice. I'm going to hold it up still. I didn't mean to put it down, so that
That's all right. It's great. The viewers can see it.
Yeah.
So I love this. To begin with, this is a painting, and it's before he turns to collage. It's 1942. He's been studying line drawing with George Grotzi, who's a German artist who fled Germany in 1932. He's working with a reed pen to draw black lines, which you can see there. He is in a phase that is, in his art, he began by being a cartoonist, and then he moved to social realism. And this is social realism. This was painted just before he went into World War II. He often shows, you can sort of see his cubist take in their features. He often draws three men together. I'm thinking of himself, his father, his grandfather, dad, and his great-grandfather. And to me, this is one of those paintings that has so much to say. The three folk musicians are very different from one another. The one in the middle, it looks exhausted. You can see he's been traveling around. The one on our left is kind of pugilistic. He looks kind of tough. And the guy on the right is sort of a mystic, either a minister or a seer of some sort. But Bearden's also showing us through this the origins of folk music, the sacred music in the church, traveling musicians, bars and juke joints. You know, it's all there just with these three people. And you'll see these guys. These guys have a long life. They turn up in collage in the 60s and 70s and 80s. They turn up in groupings throughout his work.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, you know, it's that visual iconography that I think that, you know, I particularly started to associate, you know, with Bearden after that initial introduction of these sort of what I think of, or, you know, I think a lot of people do, is these classical Southern icons and themes of, you know, the men with the guitars, trains, different flora and fauna. And, you know, it is easy for me to understand when I look at another work, or, you know, like when we move on to a later work, like one of his Charlotte pieces, and I'll hold it back up in a second, why people would interpret these kinds of work as autobiographical, and how they, you know, through your research into the archival record versus, you know, Bearden's memory and sometimes interviews, you know, how they form a more complete picture in some ways of both the archival, you know, of what the actual archival record is about his life in Charlotte at that time, using these different elements of artistic interpretation that we see as he starts to move into his collage work. And I wondered if you could, I mean, I'm really interested in his Charlotte series. You know, as you were talking about your exposure to him in Charlotte, and how Charlotte's kind of adopted, you know, or not adopted, but, you know, claimed him in some sense.
Well,
Yeah.
he, you can put that down and we'll put it back up in a sec.
Sure. Thank you.
I just went to some background. He left Charlotte with his parents when he was 5. The story went, and he said, I went back during the summers to visit, but painstakingly searched his summers, and instead he went to visit his grandmother, who had moved to Greensboro, or or later to Maryland. He, I think, only went back to Charlotte once while he was a child, and that was when he was about 9 years old. So you don't remember that much when you're 5 years old. So these coming from interpreting his work on the South or on Charlotte literally as autobiography is really faulty, because his memory wouldn't have been that robust, really, by the time he's in his 60s, 70s, and 80s, of something that he experienced for a short time. But he was extremely happy in Charlotte, and he took sensory memories. He took sort of haunting snatches of things, and he spun stories around them. He had a Sears and Roebuck catalog that was dated 1900, and he used the material culture in that as a memory prompt. So I think what he imagined about the South is as important as whether it was true or not. And so there's no real contradiction there. So looking at that, let's look at that. This is called Watching the Good Trains Go By. It is actually, if you stand in the front yard of his family's Victorian home with the circular front porch, circular veranda, what you see across in front of you is the Southern Railway main line and some hills in the background. He always depicted those hills. He remembered that view. That's somewhat autobiography. He depicted these hills. However, he's also citing Cézanne, because it's Mont Saint-Victoire as well. And he loves Cézanne, an original Cubist, and is constantly citing him. Watching the Good Trains Go By is a collage from 1964, early successful collage about the Great Migration. Are they going to take the train? Are they going to stay put in Charlotte? And for example, the guy in the hat and the checkered outfit, I'm pretty convinced will take the train. The folk musician in the middle with the guitar, there he is again, probably has taken more trains than he wants to remember. It's a little bit hard to see the man in the tan uniform with his back turned to us. Probably a World War I soldier walking away, heading north. He's definitely going to take the train. The detail in here is amazing. It's so much fun. There's a wash pot, there's a daisy. Some people are barefooted. There's a big chicken, which we can't see so well in the bottom right of it. So it's just daily life, domesticity, but also it's the promise of change, whether or not you'll accept that change or not.
Yeah, I just lost my train of thought.
That's because there's so many trains in Bearden's work.
I totally forgot again. I think when thinking about, like, you're talking about the view that he sees, or that he would have remembered from that porch, and thinking about, as you were talking about the Sears Roebuck catalog, that's what I was trying to think of, and I wrote down Albert Murray here. But yeah, the way that, you talk a little bit about his relationship with the writer, Albert Murray, and how, it was through their dialogue and story sharing with each other that some of these memories surface, and like Bearden's kind of willingness to allow, like Murray to like pull those things out of him, whether through music, oftentimes. And I wonder if you could talk about that relationship a little bit, because I see that in some of these collages. I mean, even though maybe this is before they met, I think possibly this one, but I wonder if you could talk about his relationship with Murray a little bit.
So Albert Murray is from Alabama. He went to Tuskegee. He later lived in Paris. He was in Paris when Bearden was there in the early 50s, but went back and taught ROTC at Tuskegee before he moved to New York. And I'm vague on that too right now, sometime in the 60s. Albert Murray is a fabulous writer. He's had always been one of my favorite people. He wrote a book called South to a Very Old Place, where he tours the South and reports back, and it reads the stream of consciousness. It's fabulous. So Murray loved Bearden. Murray would sit in the studio with Bearden while Bearden was working. Bearden worked all the time, literally all the time, and play music, play jazz. Murray had more immediate and recent and longer experience of the South, and more of the Deep South, not Charlotte, but Tuskegee. So he was able to spin stories about the South, and it's a kind of therapy. He sparked something. Bearden would never know if it was a memory, or if it was a composite memory, or if it just was his imagination as he worked. And so that was lovely. He did most of his Southern work with Albert Murray around most of the time. And often Murray named the work. Bearden didn't.
Yeah, thank you. And this relates to a question that came in that I think that we could talk about now before the end, but just someone asking, could you talk about Bearden's life in New York City? What did he do there? How did that affect his art? And you do talk about that in your book brilliantly. It's really interesting to learn about him as a young man in the city, and his mother being so, prominent in politics at that time. And the question goes on to comment, I know someone whose father worked with Bearden in the city welfare department.
Oh, really? Ha!
Bearden apparently offered my friend's father a piece of art, and the father declined.
No.
Obviously, this was prior to Bearden's fame. When did he become famous? So it's kind of a two-part question. What was his life like in the city, and when did his fame start to rise?
Great question, and all true. Okay, so they go to Harlem in the 20s. He's very much a part of the Harlem Renaissance, albeit a little bit young, not a leader, an emerging person. He decided in 1930 to leave Lincoln University and go for 2 years to study fine arts at BU. So he did that 30, 32. Then he went back to NYU and got a degree. He was a mathematician. And then he went to the Art Students League. His mother, and studied with George Gressy, his mother, Bessie Bearden, went to New York determined to make herself a political figure. Women got the right to vote in New York earlier, but when she got there in the late teens, and then after women's suffrage passed, she became a Democrat. Most African Americans were Republicans, but she saw that she had a way into the higher echelon of power by becoming a Democrat, because Harlem voted Democrat, and Harlem was turning from mostly white residents to mostly Black residents. So she organized campaigns. Ultimately, she was in the African-American Tammany Hall Democrats. You couldn't do much in Harlem without Bessie Bearden's backing by the end of it. She was a confidant of Eleanor Roosevelt. She founded the settlement house that Jacob Lawrence learned to paint and draw in. And she was deputy commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, in case you didn't think she was already important enough. So Montgomery was kind of blessed. His mother loved him. He was devoted to her. His father worked for the city. And Bessie Bearden wanted him to be a doctor. He wanted to be an artist. When he got out of NYU, he couldn't support himself being an artist. So he took a job with the New York Social Welfare Department as a social worker, which with a degree in math was, there weren't that many people with social work training. At first, he worked with African-American migrants to New York. And then by the end of his 30-year career, he worked with Roma people, with Gypsy people. And so he kept that day job all the way through, except for the time he went to France in 1950 and during World War II. He began really in the late 60s, early 70s. He went to Guggenheim. He began to be able to support himself through his art. And he finally gave up the social work job, but he loved it. Think of Bearden. He gets out in the streets. He goes and meets people. He goes into homes and rooms. And, it's a real visual feast for him to be a social worker. He painted every day starting at 4 o'clock and always had a studio and always worked, but didn't get much recognition. Not many Black artists got much recognition until the late 50s, early 60s.
Thank you. Thinking about his life in New York, as you were just, referencing, and we, mentioned Albert Murray, but, also thinking about the community and the home that his great grandfather built in Charlotte. One of the things that I learned in your book about Bearden's life is how connected he was to these different communities, and he seemed to kind of thrive when he was connected to, along with his cousin Charles Henry Alston, you just mentioned the name of the group, and now I can't remember the early Harlem painter group that they organized, the artist group.
The Harlem Artists Guild.
Yes.
There were 50 Black artists, yeah, and Studio 306.
To support
that was
each other.
Spinky's Austin's studio that he organized. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, do you feel like that, it does seem like when you're reading the book that, it was at those times were his most prolific. We tend to think of artists as solo people or these individuals, or maybe, as a social worker, he's going out by himself and coming back and interpreting these, things, via his visual medium. But, it was with these communities that he really thrived. I wonder if you can, if that's true, or that was kind of my interpretation. I wonder if you can talk about that or comment on that.
He was an incredibly social person, sociability. He wanted to be with people. Once he became real successful in the late 60s, he had his own studio, and that was out on in Long Island City. But he had to, because you couldn't afford your own studio, but also he thrived in that kind of setting. He joined the Harlem Artists Guild, and then later founded Spiral during the Civil Rights Movement, which was an association of Black artists. He was one of the founders, to think about how artists could participate in, depict, etc., the civil rights movement. But he, for all of that affinity for people, and he went out to the Savoy every night. He also spent a lot of time in his adult life alone or alone with his wife in St. Martin. He'd come from a big family. He was just really good with people, comfortable with people.
Yeah, thank you. Another question, and I think this, speaks to, going to encourage everyone to please buy and read the book, because there is a lot that we're not going to be able to cover about Bearden's life. And here, I'm kind of ashamed that I forgot this already because my wife is from Pittsburgh, but we haven't even begun to address his Pittsburgh connection, and two, looking at his work as an archive of migration, and certainly he absorbed a lot from his time in Pittsburgh, and seeing the workers and the working men, some of those characters that we saw in the musicians, possibly informed by that time. There wasn't really a question. It was just like, wasn't he in Pittsburgh? So
yes, I want to talk about Pittsburgh. So he was in Pittsburgh twice. His family had been living in, during World War I, his dad took a job on the railroad in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, Canada. And when that ended, they ultimately moved back to Harlem, but they needed to reestablish themselves. So they sent Romier to, people called him Romier, Romier to live with Bessie Bearden's mother and stepfather. And they ran 2 boarding houses. He lived there from the time he was about 8, 9, 10, for the first time, and with steel workers, probably 12, 15 steel workers, although the census shows 6, but they would have the attics full of cots for steel workers because people worked on shifts. So it was a pretty, let me see if I can hold up some Pittsburgh work.
I have Pittsburgh memory right here.
Great.
But
okay.
I can find another one.
It's so interesting. It was a time when Bearden was surrounded by men. Charlotte, the South, that work tends to be matriarchal. But this work in Pittsburgh is very cubist, very, very, a little bit scary looking, the way that men look so robust and so angular. And this is my favorite, which we can't really see. Can you lift it up just a little bit? Sorry. This is, it's too dark. It's hard to see it. It's not that you're not holding it well. So this is what August Wilson based a play on, and it's called The Mill Hand's Lunch Bucket. The woman, his great-grandmother running the boarding house, is in the yellow. She looks exhausted. The mill worker, Bearden, hands are very important to Bearden, and this is a very powerful figure. He's reaching for his lunch bucket. 2 people are sort of crouched over the table, but there's something really interesting in this. See the rocking chair? The rocking chair seems to look heartbroken. And down in the front, which we can't really see, there's a blue table with a white cloth. And then at the bottom below that, there's a little boy all curled up, just all by himself. So for all the wonderful rectangular blocking and color and domesticity, there's still a tone here of stress, I think. He returned to spend his last 2 years in high school in Pittsburgh with his grandmother and grandfather. By then, I found out oddly enough, their borders were white people. They were Germans, like August Wilson's father was. So there was, and families. But Bearden and Pittsburgh have a recurring, long-term, kind of fraught relationship. He always wanted to be at home in Harlem with his mama and daddy. But his daddy drank, and that was hard. So.
Yeah, and there was a kind of a comment, more than a question, just related to what you were just talking about, which was just talking about the influence of Pittsburgh on his work and any relationship between his work and kind of his life as similar to August Wilson and Billy Strayhorn, who both had families in North Carolina and then grew up and spent time in Pittsburgh. So, you know.
And Pittsburgh in particular was a North Carolina destination because of when the jobs opened up and when what the jobs were in World War I, et cetera, and World War II as well. So both Harlem and Pittsburgh were great, and Washington, D.C., of course, were North Carolina great migration destinations.
Yeah, you know, I mean, one thing I actually just thought about as we were talking about the, you know, thinking about the hills in his work is, you know, that's something that struck me the first time that I visited Pittsburgh, which was, you know, in my 30s, and the kind of views between the hills of railroad tracks and the hills in the background, and I now wonder if that's something that maybe he is also thinking about in the hills that he puts into that work, because there's nothing like it, right? You're in the way that you see through those neighborhoods and the hills of Pittsburgh is very unique.
Good point. Good point. Trains were always with Bearden, and they're always in his art, but Pittsburgh, Charlotte, less so in Harlem.
I definitely want to welcome any other questions. You know, we have about 15 minutes left, but I also, you know, we looked at some of his social realism and kind of his early collage, but you know, we you know, as looking at his early collage, you know, versus some of his later collage, and we were, you know, talking about this work, which is also part of the later part of the Mecklenburg series, and you know, his use of color changing so much over his life, and really just striking and beautiful colors in these 1970s collages. And I will point out, this is also the cover of the book, so there's reason for us to select this one. But I wonder if you could talk about this period and kind of, you know, where these influences came from. I know a little bit from his wife, or his, you know, his experience living with his wife or marrying his wife.
It's true. I chose that because it is such a good example of the way he worked. He worked with rectangular shapes, and the first thing he did was lay out the canvas in rectangular shapes. Remember, he's a mathematician, and he said, I've always been a cubist. So there's that influence in there as well. But what he becomes incredibly interested in, and one reason that his collages are so great, is he's interested in color as space, and space, blank space, as color. And so he's interested in the construction of it. Color, he comes south in 1940, and amazingly, he spends a month or so goes to Charlotte, stays in Greensboro. Color begins to enter his work more and more. The social realist period in the 30s was pretty bland, pretty not using color the same way. But after he and his wife, Nanette Rohan, whose parents were from St. Martin, built a house in St. Martin, color really does begin to take a major role in his artistic practice. And there are even collages set in Charlotte or in the South. He's got a great series on New Orleans, but that have tropical aspects to them. So color becomes for him more and more vivid, even as he has in the 1980s bone cancer and is working in incredible pain, and his own existence is becoming less vivid.
Yeah. Couple more questions coming in. An interesting one, just not about Bearden's artistic practice, but is it true that Bearden was a more than decent baseball and possibly football player in addition to his artistic talents?
He was a good baseball player. I think he was an adequate football player.
Yeah.
He played football and baseball in high school, baseball in college, but when he went to BU to study fine arts for 2 years, he wasn't ever going to get a degree because his mother wouldn't let him do that, but she did let him go study art before he ended up with his teacher's degree. He played with the semi-pro team there and was scouted, the story goes, and I'm sure he was scouted, but I'm not sure if this is true. The story goes that he was offered a position with a major league team if he would pass for white. Anyone who knew Bearden at the time, I mean, he's relatively famous. His mother is famous, and she would have killed him if he'd done that anyway. But the whole family is sort of really well known. And so I'm not sure I believe that story, but he was a good baseball player, a good pitcher. He's a big guy all his life and has a lot of power.
Thank you. This is a question about the critical reception of his work over time. And we addressed earlier sort of like when he kind of started getting a lot of attention, but what was the critical reception of his earlier social realist work or earlier paintings, maybe before his collages kind of became more what he was known for?
Great. This gives me a moment to talk about abstraction too. So art was segregated in the 30s, incredibly segregated. And the people who saw his social realist work were mostly African-American people. And they like it. It's politically conscious. It's portraying workers. It's making statements. But in the and so he got a lot of recognition, but he wasn't well known by white people. Getting well known by white people happened when he began working in the 1940s in abstraction. Do you have one of those? Yeah. And he was represented by Stanley Kuntz, who was Picasso's representative in America, the Motherwell, et cetera, the leading person who brought abstract art. Bearden worked in what he himself called semi-abstraction. And I thought this would be a difficult thing for me to write about, but I love his abstract art. It's also telling stories. He fell out of abstraction. This is the Crucifixion of Christ. And Kuntz turned to something he called intrasubjective, which meant that art wasn't representational. Bearden wanted to represent something. He wanted to be able, he thought that abstract art would give him the ability to be more universal, represent figures that weren't simply Black figures, because he was always getting stereotyped into the Black experience, or he had the burden, he felt the burden of representation. So abstract art at first was freeing, but then when it moved past representation, he became terribly depressed about it. But you can see that cartooning, social realism, abstract art really are a great background for collage. And he brings all of that into collage after not doing any artistic work for about 5 years in the early 50s.
Thank you. So a two-part question related, and we were touching on this very briefly through Bearden's work with Spiral and the Harlem Artists League. But was Bearden vocal about race relations and civil rights? And did he let his art speak for that, or did he make statements or write about it himself as well?
He was always vocal about civil rights. He is a bridge between the Harlem Renaissance and the civil rights movement. But in the 30s, he's in his 20s. He's a cartoonist for The Crisis, the NAACP's magazine, and a cartoonist for the Baltimore Afro-American. And his cartoons are almost all political. What is that? Don't buy where you can't work?
Yes, it is.
Okay, right. Give us a job, don't buy where you can't work. The boycotts in the early 30s against shopping in stores that won't hire African Americans as employees. He did lynching, protest in art. He also writes. He's political in that he's talking about Black representation in a lot of his writing about art. By the time the civil rights movement comes, he has had a long artistic career, and obviously, and he's working in collage and he's eager to help. But that art has a history of its own in turning to the Black arts movement. And by the time that the Black arts movement starts in the late 60s, early 70s, Bearden is already an artist of decades, and is sometimes his artistic practices, he finds himself at odds with thinking in the Black arts movement and what represent. The thing that he struggles about his entire life is representation. What does it mean to an artist? What can an artist represent? And this comes up again in the civil rights movement, although he's, a founding member of Spiral, and he's right there. He's just simply a little bit older than a lot of the people.
Someone just commented, they really appreciate your point about how you can't be as definitive today as you used to be because there are new facts with greater access. So, a strange kind of paradox almost, that having more information makes us less definitive because it's now contradicting previous facts. So thank you.
I'm president of the Southern Historical Association, and my presidential address is going to be about that. I think we historians all feel like the more information we get, the less we know these days. And we have to think about writing practices that allow us to admit doubt, because we're going to know a lot more next week.
There are no more questions right now. I'll ask one more and see if one more comes in. As the book kind of concludes with his reception and revival in Charlotte, and we kind of started with that, is talking about your inspiration starting this research. How did he feel going back to Charlotte, or were there mixed feelings going back even at that time where it was due to great success, back to a town where, Jim Crow, essentially, destroyed his family, everything that they had built, his great grandfather had built, this, community that's so representative in his art, which, as you point out, is now a parking lot, or not next to the parking lot for the stadium, for the Panthers stadium. So, I mean, how did he feel about that embrace, I guess, of a community that he only knows through these memories?
Bearden was really savvy about white people. He knew when Charlotte embraced him in 1970, and the Mint put on an exhibition of Bearden works. He knew what the stakes were for the Mint, for Charlotte business leaders, etc. And he got a little irritated at the Mint in the planning of the thing when they called him an expatriate. And he said, I never left Charlotte except physically. He's implying there that you're Charlotte, you're occupying my Charlotte, basically. So he says he's not going to calm down to the exhibition, but he goes to Brooks Brothers and buys a tux and comes down and has a ball. And Charlotte was not a backwater. There were plenty of people. Lou Powell with the Charlotte Observer wrote about him, Richard Mashaw. They knew what the score was. They knew that this was someone who grew up and whose family had suffered from racism and Jim Crow and had been in a very prominent African-American family in town. So they, the stories are hilarious, the kind of walking the tightrope between grandmother's cabin in Cotton Field and what his life was really like. He came, he loved Atlanta. He had come to Greensboro several times because his aunt taught at Bennett College and lived there for decades. So he loved the South. He loved it more in memory. He loved it more in the rearview mirror than he did as a place to live. You know, he didn't move back to the South. He certainly stayed in New York.
Thank you. Okay. Two more questions. The last ones are really quick ones. So I'll end with that one, but I'm going to start with the one that came in last, but I'll get to the other one. So don't worry, person that asked a question. I'm struck by how much Bearden's work resonates with people across generations, including children. Did Bearden share any of his thoughts on the impact of art on children, particularly African-American children?
Yes, he wrote a book of art for children. Yes, absolutely. He didn't have children, but he had children around him, and he understood how important it was because it had been so important to him. When he was in Pittsburgh and lonely, I didn't mention this earlier, I should have, in the boarding house, his grandmother bought him a box of paints and an easel, and that's what saved him. And he also believed that art, for all of his training and all of his work, he believed that art was accessible to everyone. He invited you to come in and see what you saw. There wasn't any sort of one way to depict his art.
Thank you. And last question, and thank you again for being here today and being such a generous guest and sharing your thoughts and your book with us. From Dr. Ferris, what led you to Ireland and what's next? What's the next project, is there one, if you can share?
What led me to Ireland, sort of what led Bearden to St. Martin. Ireland is sort of like the South in the 1950s as far as really friendly people, peace and quiet, and basically at the time it was a 5-hour plane flight from New Haven. Since we moved here part-time in 2008, we have a whole life and friends here, and it's beautiful. It's a kind country, and they just declared free universal health care for all children in Ireland. So that's one of the differences of the sort that warmed my heart about this place.
And any next project?
Bill Ferris.
You
I'm going to write it right now. I'm going to write my presidential address about the archives and writing history in these times. And then I'll give the Fleming lectures in November. And I'm writing about cultural appropriation since it's such a hot topic now. I'm writing about when white people appropriated Black culture throughout the 20th century, in the teens, 20s, and ultimately in New Orleans with Jazz Fest and the jazz scene there. So, and how that's been written about, but I want to add how African Americans at first accepted it and then began to fight back during the Harlem Renaissance and say, don't you appropriate our culture? So we'll see how that goes. 2/3 done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gilmore. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's been fun.
Thanks to all of our viewers and listeners today. Thanks to everyone that's attended Off the Shelf this entire season. Thanks to Monica, who I think is here now, and I will sign off.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Yeah, thank you, Glenda, and thank you, Erin. This has been such a wonderful conversation, a great way to spend our lunch hour. So thank you again for hosting, Erin and Glenda, for being here, for talking about your work and your book. I'm really looking forward to reading your next work. I also want to say thank you to my libraries and press colleagues, especially members of the Idea Council, Katie Fanfani and Sonia Bonchek, for everything they did to make this event possible. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. Don't forget to visit uncpress.org to use your 40% discount to buy these books. Check out the promo code in the chat. Katie put that in there earlier. Also, please stay tuned for future Off the Shelf series programming. We hope to see you all in the fall. Take care.